Welcome to Kom Maar Dichter, a series in which I, Artemis Kubala of Speaking Bug, sit down with the person behind the book. Why do they write? How does a book come to life? And what do they hope to set in motion? Glad you're listening.
In this moving personal memoir, a social scientist who studies resource conflicts in the Great Lakes region of Africa shares her own story. The author discusses the ethical and emotional struggles of her work and shows how hearing stories of crisis and conflict triggered her own battle with post-traumatic stress. She also reflects on her position and privilege as a white, middle-class, educated woman working to bridge two continents. This book talks about the often hidden challenges of academic life, where the push for productivity often reinforces unequal power relations and overshadows researchers' well-being. The story invites readers to see the toll that gathering knowledge can take and celebrates the profound impact of embracing vulnerability and human connection in the world of science.
That was it.
Yes, so welcome Ansoms to the podcast.
Hi.
I'm really happy to have you here. And you are a professor of social sciences at UCLouvain. And you also coordinate the interdisciplinary research team on climate change and natural resource conflict in the Great Lakes regions of Africa.
Yeah, I think that's kind of me.
And your book is titled Space for Stories, Passion and Vulnerability in Research. And it's indeed somewhere between a memoir, a reflection, and a meditation on what it means to listen to other people's stories. Mm-hmm. And I was really moved reading it. Also, in some points, it catapulted me back to a time that I was doing the research in the Maastricht region. Mm-hmm. So it kind of opened memories that I myself didn't open for a long time ago. And you are a social scientist researching resource conflicts and rural transformations in Central and Eastern Africa, but in this book something shifts. Instead of only studying other people's stories, you also begin to tell your own story. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's a good point where we can start our conversation. Because do you remember the moment when you realized that this book had to be written?
It's a good question. Actually, initially I didn't intend to write a book, or at least not to make a book out of this. I started to write about my own story at a very particular stage of my life when I was not doing too well. It was a time when I was confronted with huge upheaval, emotional shreddedness, and so I started to write. I think I wrote about 3 times this volume, maybe even 4. Lots of stories that I had to recapture, remember, and writing was for me a way to bring the story back to me. And particularly also to rediscover the emotional layers of my stories. But initially, I definitely didn't intend to write a book or to take a book from that. It was only later when I shared some of the parts that I wrote with friends, which helped me to re-own my own stories, that some of them told me, yeah, there's something more in this than just your own life and your own making sense of it. And that's the moment I started to realize, maybe it might be an interesting idea to transform it into a book. And eventually I did.
And the things that you wrote before it came together as a book, was it already in a non-academic language?
Yeah, definitely. It was, what in the book are italic parts, which more relate to my own stories. The things I wrote were basically only that. So I really stepped away from the scientific language in the things I wrote to engage and re-engage with the emotional part of my work. And so, it was not an academic text, not at all.
And that really came naturally. But at the same time, of course, as the academic that you also are, you have been writing in the academic style lots and lots, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think, quite early in my life, I decided that academic language would be the language in which I was expressing myself or would express myself, because I saw legitimacy in that language. Of course, it's also a way of taking distance of certain parts of what you're studying, and it also has huge limitations. But it took time for me to realize those limitations and to realize how much cannot be told through scientific and academic language. And so my book was kind of a vengeance of my own sense of writing that had been locked up in more purely academic form.
So, and maybe the forms of languages also are like a metaphor, because when you're doing research as an academic, you kind of tend to tuck away the fact that you're also human and that you're there as a whole person.
Yeah, and I've had my training in quantitative business economics. It also depends a bit on the discipline, because there are some disciplines that allow scientists to be more human. But in my discipline, it definitely wasn't. I really learned that my own story, my own emotions, my own part of being a scientist was not legitimate, and that I had to not just tuck it away, but that it was a scientific mistake to give space to that. And so even though I saw the shortcomings of that, and I became intrigued by anthropology and other types of disciplines that look at things differently, I hadn't learned how to do that, and I didn't really know how to give shape and space to that. So yeah, academic language in some ways is very reductive. It's not just reductive in the sense of putting distance between the writer and the topic. It's written. It's mainly in English, sometimes French and Spanish, but in languages that dominate, that also silence a lot of voices that are not expressed in English. And so, yeah, I think there's many things you can't express through scientific language that also need to be part of knowledge systems.
So, and the fact that writing in a narrative style isn't something that in your field of specialty was so common?
Yeah.
Was it like, did it make you feel like you were taking a risk doing it?
Yeah, definitely. Well, it was not just the style, it was also the topic, talking about emotionality, talking about things that don't fit into a neat framework. I felt the risk. Initially not, because I was not writing for a public and I didn't think I would publish it. But then when I started to think about making this into a book, I definitely had lots of doubts on whether it was interesting, whether I was not going too far with this. And I also had colleagues who really told me not to publish. There was one colleague, I remember, he told me, yeah, this is really nice, but it's something you should publish when you're like about 60. Because it's very risky to show yourself as a vulnerable human being at your age. You still have 20, 25 years in front of you, so you don't have the luxury to be vulnerable. And so, yeah, those kind of echoes stayed with me. But I decided in the end to not go with that and to just go forward with daring to talk, just as many of my respondents have. When many of my research participants have also talked about their stories with often much higher risks than the one I took in publishing this book. So they inspired me to dare to speak, to dare to write.
And thankfully so that you indeed dared. And now looking back, after having written the book, was it like a more liberating experience or an exposing experience?
I think it was both. It was liberating in a sense of the writing was a way for me to tell the story again to myself and to see space, then to claim the space for that. Particularly inside myself. So yeah, there was liberation, but there was also exposure, definitely. These stories are now out there. People can read them. They can relate to them. They can be inspired, but they can also find them stupid or abuse them. So there is a risk in sharing your own story from a memoir narrative, but at the same time, it's a matter of being good, well surrounded, and I think I'm now at this stage where I look at the book. There's also, when I wrote it, it was a couple of years ago, so there's a bit of a time that has gone since then. And so it's part of me, but it's not only that. It's not the essence of me. There's many other things to me. And so, yeah, I'm okay with it. When I look at it, I'm like, yeah, good that it exists. At the same time, there's so many other things in life that also deserve to be embraced.
Yeah, and the fact that you also brought doubts and worries into your story, because you explained how sometimes you thought like, should I write this? Mm-hmm. Or I fear that my positionality is going to have this or this impact, or I don't want to portray any of the vulnerable stories that have been shared with me in a certain way. I think that's very powerful that you brought it into the tissue of the book.
Yeah, there was a lot of doubt, and I think at some point I thought I'm not entitled to publish the book if I haven't figured it out. And then I realized that figuring it out is an illusion. So it's better to give space to the doubt itself. And as I say somewhere towards the end, there's no happy ending. There's no culmination. There's no aha moment. Now I've obtained all this wisdom, and it will not happen. Life is just navigating through, and it's beautiful like that, including the doubt, including the uncertainty.
Yeah, and like a while ago you explained like being vulnerable is a luxury. Let's hope that by writing this book you kind of changed this mindset for many people, right? Because it shouldn't be a luxury to be vulnerable.
It's true. It shouldn't be a luxury. At the same time, it still is. I'm pretty aware of my privilege. I was able to write this book because I have a stable employment, because I could take the time to reflect. And for many people around me, many people that I also admire, that luxury isn't there. The luxury is related to job security, to nationality, but also to class, to skin color, to the way in which a white European woman receives a stage and a space in which she's able to express herself that, for example, for a Black African woman would not necessarily have been that obvious. And so I hope there will be more space for more types of vulnerability in the future. I really felt that I had to do my part, otherwise my message would have been not coherent with what I plead for, more space for stories. But at the same time, I'm fully aware of the fact that there are still many stories that are not written, that are not given that space. And so, yeah, I hope there will be more space for those stories as well in the future.
I recently heard somebody explain privilege as, well, when you have an option, mm-hmm. then you are in a position of privilege.
Yeah.
And I wonder maybe if that option of writing the book kind of became more of a duty for you.
Mm-hmm. At some point it did, not at all stages, but at some point it did, particularly when at some point I started to talk about the post-traumatic stress, for example. And in the beginning I thought I was very alone, but then I started to realize that quite some people who do my job have an emotional weight in their backpack, and some of them are also suffering from post-traumatic stress. And so when I started to get an insight in those stories, when you start sharing your story, other people start sharing their stories, I realized how much privilege there still was in my life, being surrounded. And then, there was this thing of we need to know more of this. We need to make sure that the academic world, more broadly, realizes the toll that research might take, the need for care, the need for time to reflect, for professional healthcare as well. And at some points it became a bit of a mission. Sometimes the mission was also a bit too, at some points I was a bit too much obsessed as well.
What do you mean?
What do I mean? At some point, particularly in relation to my female vulnerability, I started to realize that the things I have lived are not exceptional, but that in the academic world there is, for example, very limited space to talk about harassment during research. And at some point it really made me very angry. In my university, there was a big flow of talking about Me Too and the power abuse that had been present in working relationships. And that is obviously very important as a topic. But next to that, there are many female researchers who live through stories of harassment in relation to their research or in research environments. And so at some point, I realized that there was not really space for those stories. They were either dramatized, either silenced, sometimes ridiculized, but also very often the reaction would be awkwardness. And so at some point, I really thought, I have to carry all of this. But you have to search for your feet on the ground when you want to carry those things. And I think at that particular point, I wasn't able to carry that yet. So I had to also search for my own pace in carrying the bigger story of this story, and to not be on the barricades in all the different fields that this story touches upon. So I find that it's still ongoing. It's still a work in progress. At some points, I have a temperament. So at some points, I really feel how some of the things that touch me can really carry me in a way that it becomes maybe too much, both for me as well as in translating that to an environment. In order for an environment to be able to understand, you have to be able to explain things in a way that environments can relate to. And sometimes that is still a quest.
I think in opting for the narrative style, that's already a really big step towards being accessible to a broad public. But also I noticed that you take refuge to nature a lot of the time as a power that regulates, that brings back balance. Can you tell a little bit more about that?
I really enjoy walking in forests. For me, trees and forests are often a metaphor of many things that I see in my life. The fact that you see trees above the ground, but you also know that they're connected underneath. The forest as an ecosystem, but not just a biological togetherness of various species, but also a system that interacts, that collaborates, that sometimes competes, but that exists together. And for me, the forest is a nice metaphor, both in writing, but also it's a space for me when I feel that I need a space to reflect. I often go to the forests.
Yeah, and you kind of brought that into the book as well. So as a reader, when we were with you in one of the more personal stories, then we also kind of had this balancing effect of your explaining of the trees and the forest. So I think it's really good that you also put it in the book, and we kind of, as a secondary effect as readers, also get to regulate our emotions, because you cannot read a book without experiencing emotions as well.
True. And trees, they often outlive human beings, so that is also a lesson for, I think, humanity, that when we think we're the center of things, well, there's many things that surround us that will outpace us or outgrow us. And yeah, it's a lesson of modesty as well.
It puts things in perspective, right?
Things in perspective, indeed.
So the book opens with encounters from fieldwork in Rwanda, moments where official narratives about development collided with the lived reality of people in rural communities. And are there particular encounters or conversations that never really left you?
There are many. Some of them are in the book. Many of them aren't. Some of them were usually personal. Yeah, there's many stories that really stuck with me, particularly meeting farmers who live in spaces where there is a lot of vulnerability also ongoing. When we talk about resilience, we often give some naive definition to it, being capable to overcome that. When you look at how people, for example, in Rwanda live, and particularly after the awful events of what happened in history of Rwanda with the genocide in 94, resilience gets another tune. So there's many people that still stick with me. But way beyond it, it's many stories that blended, also stories of researchers themselves. I call her Emi in my book. Her real name was Liane Fuchi. She was an amazing scholar that was very generous to me as a very young, naive researcher. And she really taught me a lot without teaching me. She invited me to stay in her apartment for months, just when I needed some space to hide from the world. And I really enjoyed her company, but also her life lessons. Another person is Solange Musiku. She's called Davina in the book. She was a Congolese journalist who had this beautiful touch to interacting with people, and she was also very generous to me. So it's not just the people you meet who are actually part of your research, it's also the people you meet while navigating through your research. And yeah, many of them stay close to my heart.
Yeah, and then the metaphor of the trees and the roots comes to mind again.
Definitely. And what's also nice is I'm not a particular religious person, but what I really like, or maybe not religious in the traditional sense, but what I really like about the metaphor of the forest is that also when trees fall, they never entirely disappear because the underneath is still part of the ecosystem. And what falls down on top of the soil is also part of the ecosystem. So that is a metaphor, particularly in relation to Liane and to Solange, who both unfortunately died. It's important to me to see their heritage up to today in many different things.
It's beautiful how indeed you carry them with you, but not in a heavy way, but I don't really know how to give words in a beautiful way.
Mm-hmm. There's been heaviness as well, but I think for me, mourning is a phase in which you create space for the heaviness, but also for the joy and the light that we have shared, and to make sure that that joy and light doesn't disappear when the people are no longer with us on this earth.
And then indeed in your work you meet people who share stories of trauma, conflict and loss, and you experience it yourself as well, or in a secondary way by hearing and listening to those stories. So what responsibility comes with listening to those stories?
That is a very, very good question. Well, I think first of all, listening to stories, the first real responsibility is to really listen. Because as a researcher, you enter into those stories with a very particular purpose in mind. As a researcher, you don't go in just to talk to people. You're actually collecting data. That is basically what a researcher does. But when you work with people who have gone through difficult phases of their lives, who are experiencing still up to the point where you meet them trauma, conflict, poverty, awful things, it's really important to really listen, to create space for those stories, for all the aspects, to not go for what you need from them, and to also respect their silences. A researcher is not entitled to whatever because you're creating science or building knowledge, whatever. You have to make sure that you give space to what people don't want to talk about and to respect that. And I think that is very important as a researcher, is to respect what people want to interact on, want to share with you, but also to respect what they don't want to share with you, and to respect that.
Yeah, and you explained also how you learned how silences carry meaning as well. And silence is like a whole different language.
Yeah, definitely. This is one of the things I learned from Lian Fuji. She wrote actually about this. She gave it even a scientific term. She calls it metadata. But it's true, as researchers, we're often either filling in standardized surveys, but even when we do more interviewing techniques, we are often obsessed with the exact narrative, the exact citation of what that person shared. But that is often very limiting to what people actually share. One of the stories I talk about in my book is an interview I did, or a talk while we were walking with a village head. He was talking about it was a random story about modernization in Rwanda. So in his village, the government had imposed maize as an obligatory crop. And so we walked around together, and he was telling me all the benefits of maize and how well this crop was to the community, etc. And he took me to a part of the marshlands where actually the maize was not doing well at all. So we continued walking, and he kept on giving his ramble on how wonderful maize was. And I was just thinking, oh, what he's showing, what I'm seeing here is not at all this. And at some point we stopped walking, and I will never forget this. I stand next to him and I point to sweet potatoes that was actually a forbidden crop in that region at that point. I point to the sweet potatoes and I tell him, well, this is very interesting maize you're having here. And he turns to me and he said, yeah, this is the best maize we've ever had. I see you fully captured it. And so this is just one of those examples. This was not a silence, but it was a discourse that was shared with me. If I would have taped that interview, which I didn't, but if I would have taped that interview, it would have been one big glorious picture of maize and modernization of monocropping maize, great, wonderful. Whereas what this person was showing me was something very different. And so this is often what researchers should also be interested in. We should be interested in what people hide between the lines. And those hidings can be silences, they can be little laughters, they can be expressions with double layers, triple meanings. But this is also part of research. Or they could be refusal. And this is also something I always say in my courses. When someone refuses to talk to you, it's not just something annoying, something... It's part of your research. When people don't want to talk to you, they have a reason. And it's interesting, important for you to respect it, first of all, but also to think about what that reason could be. And there's many different reasons why people don't want to talk to researchers. But there's a scientific interest into why people don't want to talk to you. So I think as researchers, we have to look beyond the pure narrative of people.
And then when you really listen in such a generous way, when you listen back from one human being to another human being, I can imagine, because the story that you just referred to about the maze is kind of like jokingly, but there are also other accounts that are really kind of traumatizing. I can imagine that holding on strictly to like a research target is also a way of protection, because I can imagine that as a researcher in such a listening setting, you get emotionally overwhelmed pretty quickly, right?
Yeah, I think you have to be careful with up to which point you go. Obviously, sometimes you don't realize. Initially in my research, I hadn't realized that talking about land conflict would have been so much connotated with the war. It was also part of the fact that I wasn't really fully tuned with cultural life in Rwanda at that point. But sometimes you get into very deep emotional layers without realizing how did we end up here. So it's important as a researcher to respect both your own limitations, but also the limitations of the research participant. But when you do get there, you have to kind of be able to cope, because you're the one who's inciting the occasion. And so this is one of the reasons why I also really insist on, when you do research on emotionally charged topics, it's not just about preparing well and reflecting on theory and methodology, etc. It's also a matter of taking care of yourself, of taking sufficient breaks, of making sure that you have space in your own life to cope with the emotional charge of the research. And when you feel that you're overwhelmed, it's time to take a break. It's really time to step away, not in the interview, after the interview, but then to really take a break and take care of yourself.
Have researchers been underestimating this, or have they not been equipped with tools or with reflexes to deal with it?
I think it's both. It's definitely both, because when you look at how researchers are trained, well, in my case, it was as a quantitative business economist, but even for researchers who are really much more in social sciences, as where I am today, we have beautiful courses on theory, on methods, even on research ethics, but often on a very procedural level. But we have very few courses in which we talk about the emotionality of research. Fortunately, I've been able to organize such a course. Over the past 5 years already, we do a winter course, a residential winter course every year on this topic, but it was not easy to create that course. And some of my colleagues really didn't believe in the utility of a course to talk about emotions as researchers. So there is a bit of a backlash of some scholars thinking it's not legitimate. Whereas, more and more we see that younger generations really express the need for space to do that. But I think within the academic system, we're not fully there yet to organize such occasions. And then it often comes down to the individual skills and responsibility of the researcher, but also in a model that is extremely competitive. And I think that's also part of the problem when you want to create space for vulnerability and emotionality. It's not easy in a context that is very competitive. And this is something I really regret, this assumption that the best science is creating in competitiveness. I really don't believe in it. I think the best science is generated in a context of collegiality, of surrounding, of being people working together. But that is unfortunately not the major way in which the academic world works today.
It brings me back to the passages in your book where you always refer to the fact that you're a team, and that the team members are uplifting but also holding each other, because there are lots of ethical dilemmas, and there is no way of excluding ethical dilemmas in research, right?
Definitely. I think this is one of the most important things that we should teach young researchers. Research ethics is not just about a checklist, a procedure that you have to follow. When you go into complicated research fields, you will get into ethical dilemmas, regardless of how well prepared you are. And it's a matter of learning to navigate them. Ethical dilemmas don't have solutions, or at least not easy solutions. There's no black or white answer. There's no, you should always or you should never. It's more a way of learning to navigate. And when you navigate ethical dilemmas, one of the most important things is to not stay alone, to make sure that you're surrounded, but also to be surrounded by a group that will not judge you. because when you feel judged, you get defensive. And you get to simplifying ways of coping with very complicated things. So I think it's rather the need for space to reflect together, and then also to respect the navigation of that person confronted with a particular ethical dilemma. That we need more of those structures built into the academic world as it's an institutional responsibility.
And you are really like opening a door, but like with it's open a little bit already. It needs to be opened more widely.
It should be opened more widely. But yeah, I mean, I was able to organize the course. I have 2 amazing colleagues who do that with me every year, so it's amazing. But at the same time, it's nice to train, but it's also necessary to providing mechanisms that will accompany people throughout their ethical dilemmas. And I definitely also think we need professional healthcare in the academic world, just like, for example, doctors or firemen, or even in the army, there is specialized healthcare to cope with the professional dilemmas of those professions. I also think as researchers, we need this, and not just for the so-called exceptional cases of researchers who work in war zones or on extremely emotionally charged topics. But when we look at the world today, being a researcher is not that easy in the era of truth, fake truth, post-truth. There's many researchers who at some point in their life face forms of intimidation, pressure, insults, and so it's not that straightforward to just say, grow a thicker skin, make sure you have an elephant layer, because that also has a price. And we don't only want people with elephant layers in the academic world. We want people who are able to interact with many different ways of the visions of life. So yeah, I think we need to work on that as an academic environment. And so yeah, we need more than just some courses and some snip snatch here and there.
So emotionality and ethics are 2 big parts of the book, but also positionality is very important in what you bring. You describe yourself as a white European academically privileged researcher working in regions marked by colonial histories and global inequalities. And how conscious were you of this positionality when you first started doing fieldwork?
I think I thought of myself back then as being very aware of this, but I think I wasn't really. The thing with privilege is when you are privileged, you often don't realize what it means to not be privileged. And of course, everyone has fields of vulnerability, but the important thing is to not associate your fields of vulnerability with what other people go through. For example, as a woman, I've gone through some nasty stories in which I was definitely not privileged in relation to my gender. But being a white Belgian woman in the academic world in Belgium is not the same thing as facing racism or class discrimination. Those are other fields of vulnerability, and particularly when various fields of vulnerability overlap, I'm not able to understand or fully grasp what it means to be, for example, a Black scholar in the Belgian world, in the Belgian academic world. I don't know how it feels to face those types of discrimination. And I thought I did. I think in the beginning, I was naive about this, and I didn't see how different things are, how different perspectives can be. I think it's important to not make your own little stories the story about lack of privilege. And that is something that I had to learn the hard way, I think, yeah.
And it's something that we can only learn together. Like, it's not something we can learn as an individual, right?
Yeah, true. At the same time, society doesn't always help us to learn about how it means to not be privileged, because so when we see how the world reinforces parts of privilege that are already there, inclusion is not always granted, and particularly also not in the academic world. So it took me a while. I think what also helped me was to, I've interacted a lot with African scholars. In my own team, the large majority are African scholars. And when you indirectly are confronted with forms of racism, in the beginning you think, yeah, but it could be a coincidence, or it could maybe be like a bureaucratic thing. It's only when after so many years and so many incidents, you really see the systematic racism that you realize that, I could think those are exceptions because I am not Black. If I had been Black, I would never have thought they were exceptions. And they're not exceptions. They're not exceptions. Racism is inherently present also in the academic world, and they're not exceptions.
I think it's really important for people who are not the subject of racism or other discrimination or structural inequalities to speak out, so that the burden of speaking out is not only on the shoulders of those who are experiencing it.
Most definitely. In my own university, we've had the diversity week in which many forms of this discrimination were named. And I remember that for quite some of the Black scholars, it was a very painful week, because when you ask people in those positions to step on stage and to talk about those times where they were humiliated, where they were harmed, where they were insulted, it's kind of like asking someone to undress. And then if afterwards that momentum is not met with concrete measures that try to solve things, then it can be very painful. It's a form of violence in itself. And this is something that privileged people don't always realize. They think by giving a stage to an underrepresented voice that they're actually doing something great and that they should even be applauded to create that space. But you often don't realize how harmful and actually traumatizing it can be for a person to have to publicly express vulnerability, and how harmful that can be when it's not met afterwards with concrete results, measures that help those people to not have to expose their vulnerability in such ways. So with my book, I've had the time to reflect. I have had the time to really think about which story will I tell, which story won't I tell. But often people in with underrepresented voices, they don't necessarily get this time. They're just thrown on stage, and then they have to represent the Black voice or the Muslim voice or the... we have to really think much better on how we create that space. It's important that there's space, but the way in which we create it should be reflected upon and not just pop up. And it's also up to the people who are actually concerned to co-define the way in which the space in which they'll talk, how that space will look like.
Yeah, and I think this is exactly one of the things that there is no solution for yet. And we shouldn't pretend that there is right now a solution for it or the right way to do it. But it's so important that it's shared, and so important that it has a place in your book as well. I can't say that I liked it, but I liked the fact how you treated this thread in the book.
Yeah, I think with our team, we reflect a lot on what decolonization of research and of science should look like. And there's a lot of buzz. There's many people say, oh, I'm using a decolonial perspective. It's often a discourse that is instrumentalized, abused, and often in a very paternalistic way. For me, decolonizing is first and for all for someone like me to be aware of my privilege, to be aware of my power, and to reflect on how that power can abuse or can harm or can silence other voices. And that is not an easy thing to do, because you touch upon your own fields of discomfort. And this is, I think, essential. If you want to reflect on decolonization, you have to dare touch upon your own fields of discomfort. That's the starting point.
That's so powerfully said.
Well, I learned it from many inspiring people and colleagues with whom I have the privilege to work together.
So, and in how you explain that it's all because of connection with other people with other perspective, other struggles, experiences with other inequalities. In many ways, you move between worlds, right? Between Europe and Africa, between academia and communities, between data and human stories. Do you more feel like you're a bridge between those worlds, or are you falling between those worlds?
Mm-hmm. That's a funny thing. Sometime an artist, a Congolese artist, told me, we could draw you with one leg in one world and one leg in the other. And I found that an interesting picture. Sometimes it's easy. You're just standing with your two legs in two different worlds. Sometimes those worlds are not that closely related, and then you have to spread. And sometimes the spreading hurts. So, I'm not sure if I'm a bridge. It's a beautiful metaphor, but maybe I'm not always able to live up to it. But in any case, I'm standing on the bridge. But it's not always easy to stand there, because you're neither here, neither there, always a bit shredded, always a bit thrown apart, but at the same time also beautifully connected to different worlds. So I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. But it's beautiful and it's challenging.
So another very striking part of the book is where you describe how hearing so many stories of conflict and suffering eventually led you to experience post-traumatic stress yourself. That is something we rarely hear researchers speak about quickly or publicly. When did you realize that the stories you had listened to were also affecting your own body and mind?
For a very long time, I didn't, or at least not the full extent of it. I thought that in some way I had learned to disconnect the deep, troublesome emotions that I experienced in listening to some of the stories with the fact that I was collecting those stories. And I think for a very long time I didn't realize the toll it was taking. Also because I didn't take a lot of moments to reflect, to take a step back, to rest. I thought I call her Lara Croft in my book. I'm not sure if it's the right image, but it's this, like this very tough woman capable of running through a bomb and of going through the world that is imploding and nevertheless get out of it alive and fully capable of still making a joke. It's a metaphor, but in some way it was how I was behaving. And it's part of, first of all, how I learned or didn't always learn to give space to my own emotions when I grew up. But it's also something that is really particular of the academic world. This image of the tough researcher capable of coping, it is a bit of an image that the macho behavior is kind of like part of the culture, particularly also in the fields in which I'm present. And I also hadn't learned about post-traumatic stress or about the possibility of secondary trauma. I didn't even really know this existed. So it took a long time. And it was really when I was fully embedded in lots of cycles of panic attack that I realized that maybe there might be something related to my work. And it took me quite a while. I remember the first time I entered in my psychologist's room. She told me, "I think you're traumatized," and I just laughed. I mean, for me, trauma was if you've gone through a genocide and your kids have been killed in front of you. That is a legitimate trauma. And in my eyes, what I had lived through or what I had experienced was not at all legitimate as trauma. So I fought a lot with the word legitimacy of trauma. It took me a long time, yeah. But I had to, because there were physical science, and so at some point that's also the scientist, like there was proof. There was physical proof that something was going on that wasn't able to explain itself through another type of diagnosis. So it took me a while.
Yeah, it's kind of the body knows, right? And there was a part in your book where you described that you were on the lake with a good friend, and you just started crying for a long time. And I made a connection with when I was doing research in Palestine, and I was on the rooftop of my building, and I was renting this room from a very, very nice family, and I don't think they know I was on the rooftop, but I spent a day just crying all the time, also because of the feeling that all these awful things, and you are really in a position of not changing anything, so you're not really giving back, you're not really making anyone's life any better. But when I was reading your accounts of it, I was thinking, I think it was good that I was crying. I think our bodies know how to regulate.
The bodies know, but the problem with a lot of scientists is that they've learned to not listen to their body. And that is a big part of the problem that I also had. My connection with my body is still not up to today. Now I know it's a flaw. I thought it was a strength, actually. I thought it was a strength to be able to overcome physical discomfort, to be able to deny even physical comfort. And now I realize it was not. But I think many scientists are people who are very strong in their heads, not necessarily strong in realizing that head is part of a bigger biosystem. For me, my body was kind of like an engine taking me from point A to point B and had to perform in what my head decided. And so I think this is part of the lesson to be learned, that when you want to keep on doing this type of job in the long run, then you have to realize that you have a body that has needs and that you have to respect. Yeah, and crying is a great way of decompressing. There's many different ways, and it also depends on culture and on how comfortable you feel. But it's important to have some kind of decompression mechanism that works for you, and that is not drinking lots of alcohol or taking drugs or going into very destructive interactions with your body. Yeah, it's important to learn to know our bodies.
The book is accompanied by illustrations by UCLouvain, which brings another dimension to the narrative. Why was it important for you to combine research with visual storytelling as well?
Yeah, I really believe in the power of art. Unfortunately, very often when we combine science and art, we see art as the thing that illustrates, the thing that comes after the science has been done. And it's unfortunate because art has its own unique language and often expresses things that cannot be necessarily expressed in a scientific way. So I definitely think that when we invest in collaborations between art and science, that we should not always put science first. So for me, it was important to have illustrations in this book or with this book that are not just illustrations, but other types of expressions of what I try to interact with. And I think more broadly, as a scientific world, we should engage in that. I'm just thinking of last week, I was in Beni in northern DRC, and we were doing a workshop with civil society and various people around the table. And one of the things we often engage with is forms of theater. Theater without words, because that allows people to interpret sketches in their own way. And this time our collaborator has decided to engage deaf people in playing the sketches, and they played the sketches in sign language, which no one could understand. But it was beautiful to see how they gave life to a story in a very different way, in a very different language, than anyone in the room could understand. And then we all interpreted what they were bringing to life. We gave our own interpretations, and the purpose was not to guess what the right story was, but rather to relate to how everyone from their perspective saw the story. But it was just beautiful to see how these actors, which were not professional actors, but people with what we could see as a handicap, actually told us something that anyone in the room who could hear could never have captured in that way. So when you look at people, you can see the shortcomings, for example, in case of a handicap, or you can see possibilities. And that day they all showed us how much was possible, and it was beautiful. So I think, arts, other ways of interacting. Art inspires us to look at other ways of interacting, and those other ways of interacting bring us to new perspectives.
So writing this book seems to have been a turning point in your own journey. What changed for you personally through writing it?
I found some more peace of mind. I became a softer person, both to myself, but I think also to my surroundings. I'm more tuned with who I am. This is it, take it or leave it. At the same time, the warmth, and even more today to see the beauty of encounter, the beauty of interactions between people. And whereas in the past, I might have definitely already seen that, but I have always tried to fit it in between the stuff that was the actual job. Today, I try to create much more space and time for those moments.
And maybe as one of the bridges to the courses that you also organize, many young researchers enter fields that expose them to complex social realities. And if you could give them one piece of advice about how to do research while remaining human, what would it be?
Well, maybe in relation to what I just said, dare to lose time. In this rat race society, we're often so occupied with all the things we have to do and to build on to-do lists, but also in research, all the things we have to master, all the things we have to do. Dare to lose time, dare to make time to drink a coffee or a tea with someone that you don't know that well, that you don't immediately see as someone that might be useful to your job or to your research. But just, the true inspiration is often in the unexpected encounters. So to make sure that that time is there, that space is there, and to dare to invest in that so-called lost time.
And at the end of the book, you return to Rwanda and reflect on how your own story has become intertwined with the stories of others. After all the journeys, conversations and stories, what do you hope readers will carry with them after finishing the book?
I think it's up to them, but maybe the legitimacy of their own story. I think everyone can be connected to some part of the book in their own unique way, and that definitely says something about their stories. So the uniqueness of every story and the worth of it to be told, to be shared, to get space.
Thank you so much, Anne, for this conversation and for writing the book.
Well, thank you. It was amazing.
This was Kom Maar Dichter. Speaker notes can be found at speakingbug.org, in English and in het Nederlands. Want to stay up to date on new episodes and more? Subscribe to The Conversation Layer, my monthly newsletter. Feedback, ideas, suggestions are always welcome at artemis@speakingbug.org. If this series speaks to you, then you'd help me enormously by leaving a rating or comment on the platform you're listening on.